Look at the silhouette of this weapon. If you are a fan of fine firearms, it is almost painful to behold. In a world of straight lines, heavy walnut stocks, and the industrial blockiness of the 1930s, the Sten gun looks like a plumbing accident that someone decided to weaponize. It is skeletal, it is metallic, and it has a predatory, unfinished elegance that makes every other rifle of the era look like it belongs in a museum. There are no sweeping curves here, no polished brass, and certainly no soul in the woodwork. To any man who knew anything about firearms in 1941, this wasn't a weapon of war, it was an insult to the craft. It was essentially a length of steel pipe. It was a few stamped pieces of sheet metal that looked like they had been salvaged from a biscuit tin in a London kitchen, and it was a spring that felt like it had been pulled out of a rusted screen door in a derelict basement. If you showed this to a pre-war British officer, a man who had spent his career polishing the brass on a Lee Enfield or feeling the precision click of a Webley revolver, he wouldn't just be disappointed, he would be deeply offended. He would have told you that you couldn't win a war with a toy made in a backyard garage, and that the British Empire was better than this piece of scrap. And yet this joke, this plumber's nightmare, this $10 tube of lead-spitting iron would go on to become the most important piece of metal in the hands of the European resistance. It was hated by the men who were forced to carry it into battle, and it was mocked by the enemies who fought against it. But eventually it became the very thing that broke the back of the Nazi occupation from the inside out. Today, we are peeling back the rust to find the hidden genius inside the ugly Sten gun and discovering how a weapon born of total desperation changed the nature of insurgency forever. Before we dive into the grit and the grease, welcome back to Timeless Arms. We are here to uncover the history the textbooks usually skip, the stories of the steel and the men who held the line when things were at their darkest. We are on a mission to grow this community and keep these historical records alive, but we can't do that without your support. If you believe that the ugly stories of military history deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button now and join the Timeless Arms family. It helps us hit our goals and ensures we can keep bringing these deep dives to you every week. The story of the Sten doesn't start in a high-tech laboratory with engineers in white coats. It starts on a cold, blood-soaked beach in northern France. The year was 1940, and the event was Dunkirk. Most people remember the miracle of the little ships and the thousands of men saved from the jaws of the Wehrmacht. But what the history books often gloss over is the price of that escape. The British Army had survived, but they had left their hardware behind to rot in the salt air. 60,000 vehicles, 2,000 heavy guns, and nearly every automatic weapon the British Empire owned was sitting in a pile on those sands. Britain was suddenly an island with plenty of courage, but almost no way to shoot back. They were desperate, truly, deeply, soul-crushingly desperate. They were buying Thompson submachine guns from the Americans at $200 apiece, which was a king's ransom in 1940. Their currency was crashing, their cities were being turned into rubble by the Luftwaffe, and their supply ships were being hunted by U-boat wolf packs that turned the Atlantic into a graveyard. Britain needed a gun that didn't require a master machinist. They needed a gun that could be built by a bicycle mechanic in a basement using scrap metal and a prayer. That is where Major Reginald Shepherd and Harold Turpin come into the picture. They were given a mandate that sounds like a suicide mission. Make a submachine gun that is fast to build, cheap to produce, and ready for mass production immediately. They didn't have time for aesthetics, and they certainly didn't have time to do things the right way. They stripped away the wood, they threw out the polish, and they essentially threw out the very concept of beauty. They gave Britain a pipe that spit lead. They called it the STEN, S for Shepherd, T for Turpin, and EN for the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield. But for the soldiers who first had one thrust into their hands, it stood for something else. The stench gun. It felt wrong in the hands. The British Tommy was used to the Lee Enfield bolt action, a rifle that felt like a piece of fine furniture. When he was handed a Sten, he felt like the government had given up on him. He felt like he was being sent to a gunfight with a piece of junk. And from a pure engineering standpoint, the Sten Mark II was indeed a disaster of compromises. It was an open bolt, simple blowback design, with no fancy locking lugs or complex gas systems. It was effectively a controlled explosion happening in a steel tube inches from your face. The vibration of the weapon was immense, and the noise was a sharp, metallic clatter that echoed in your teeth. But the real sin was the magazine. In their hurry, the British simply copied the German MP40 magazine, but they did it poorly. It was a double-stack, single-feed design that was prone to incredible amounts of friction. If you gripped the gun by the magazine, which was the natural instinct for any soldier, you would pull it slightly out of alignment and cause a catastrophic failure. The feed lips would warp, the 9mm round would catch, and the gun would jam at the exact moment you needed it most. Then there was the infamous Sten dance. Because the Sten was an open-bolt gun with a sear that was barely adequate, the safety was essentially a suggestion rather than a rule. If you dropped a loaded Sten on its buttstock, the jar could kick the bolt back just far enough to pick up a round, but not far enough to engage the sear. The bolt would fly forward, the round would fire, and the recoil would cycle the action again. Because your finger wasn't on the trigger to stop it, the gun would just keep firing on full auto until the magazine was empty. There are stories of soldiers in training barracks diving out of windows or jumping onto bunks because someone dropped a Sten and the damn thing was spinning on the floor like a deadly sprinkler. It was dangerous, it was crude, and it felt like a toy that was just as likely to kill you as the enemy. Yet this is where the massive contradiction of the Sten gun begins to take shape. Those exact flaws, those terrible, cheap, corner-cutting shortcuts, were the secret to its absolute success. While the regular army was busy complaining about the lack of wood trim, the Special Operations Executive, or the SOE, realized they had just been handed a miracle. You cannot smuggle a Thompson submachine gun into occupied Paris. It is too big, too heavy, and too American. But a Sten could be broken into 3 small pieces in about 10 seconds and hidden in a violin case, a hollowed-out loaf of bread, or even a bucket of coal. The beauty of the design was its caliber, 9mm parabellum. This was the exact same ammunition the German occupiers were using in their own MP40s and Lugers. The British started dropping Stens by the thousands into the dark forests and backyards of Europe, arming the baker, the school teacher, and the grandmother. The ugliness of the Sten was its greatest camouflage. It didn't look like a weapon of war, it looked like junk. And in the world of the shadows, looking like junk is a superpower that no precision-milled rifle can match. It costs $10 to make, meaning you could build 15 of these for the price of one American Thompson. By 1943, the German occupiers were no longer just looking for men in uniforms. They were looking for pipes. They knew that every garage in France and every basement in Poland was a potential armory for this ugly British gun. It didn't have to be accurate at 200 yards. It just had to work in a dark alley at midnight at a range of 5 feet. At that range, the Sten was king of the streets. It was a terrifying, rattling, unstoppable force that turned every street corner into a potential battlefield. It made every Nazi officer feel the hair stand up on the back of his neck when he walked past a basement window, providing a psychological weight that no amount of propaganda could match. The Sten was the voice of the people who refused to be silenced. It was the realization that in total war, perfect is the enemy of available. The Sten was available when nothing else was, and that made it the most dangerous weapon in Europe. It was the iron will of an island that refused to break, forged in a scrap heap. As we will see in the next part, it was a voice that would eventually echo through the halls of history long after the smoke of the 1940s had cleared. Thousands of men would owe their lives to this $10 pipe, and the world of warfare would never be the same again. It proved that you don't need a factory to win a war. You just need enough people willing to pick up a length of pipe and fight back. We left off with a piece of plumbing that had become the soul of the European resistance. But to truly understand why the Sten was a masterpiece, you have to look past the grease and the rusted sheet metal. You have to look at the moments when the pipe met the shadow in the middle of the night. While the regular army was cursing the Sten in the mud of the front lines, a different breed of soldier was realizing that this ugly tube of lead was the perfect tool for a very specific kind of murder. We are talking about the missions that were never supposed to be made public. We are talking about the secret variants that terrified the Gestapo, and the moments where the Sten almost failed history, only to be redeemed by the very desperation that created it. If you want to understand the psychological power of the Sten, you have to talk about the silence. Most people think of the Sten as a rattling, noisy little beast, and for the most part it was. But the engineers at Enfield did something that seemed impossible in the 1940s. They took a $10 pipe and they turned it into a ghost. They created the Sten Mark IIs. The S stood for suppressed, and this wasn't a suppressor you simply screwed onto the end like you see in a modern spy movie. It was an integral, massive sleeve that ran the length of the weapon. It was heavy, clunky, and would overheat after just 2 magazines until the hand guards were literally smoking. But it was incredibly quiet. In a crowded city or a dark forest, the only thing a sentry would hear was the faint metallic clacking of the bolt cycling back and forth inside the tube. It was the first truly effective, mass-produced, suppressed submachine gun in history. For the men of the SOE and the commandos, it was a revelation that changed the rules of engagement. Imagine the terror of a German sentry in 1943, standing guard with the best equipment the Third Reich could provide, only to see his partner collapse without a single muzzle flash or thunderous report. By the time the alarm was raised, the bridges were wired and the ghosts were gone. The Gestapo eventually issued orders that anyone caught with a suppressed Sten was to be executed on the spot. They didn't treat it like a weapon. They treated it like an instrument of terror, and they were right to be afraid. The Sten was proving that in the world of the clandestine, being good enough was much more dangerous than being perfect. However, we have to talk about the most famous moment in the Sten's history, the moment in Prague on May 27, 1942. Operation Anthropoid was the mission to assassinate Reinhard Heydrich, the hangman of Prague and the architect of the final solution. This wasn't just another hit, it was a strike at the very heart of the Nazi machine. The two assassins, Josef Gabčík and Jan Kubiš, had been trained by the British and chose the Sten as their primary weapon for the ambush. They waited at a sharp curve in the road where Heydrich's car would have to slow down to a crawl. The moment arrived, the car slowed, and Gabčík stepped out to pull the trigger, and nothing happened. The gun jammed. In that heartbeat, the legend of the useless Sten seemed to be confirmed on the world stage. But historians often miss the bigger picture of why that mission happened at all. Why were they even able to be there? They couldn't hide a Bren gun under a trench coat or walk through a Nazi checkpoint with a full-sized rifle. The Sten, with its ability to be broken down into 3 small pieces, was the only reason the mission was even possible. Even though the gun jammed, the mission succeeded after Kubiš threw a modified anti-tank grenade. The Sten didn't kill Heydrich with a bullet. It killed him with its invisibility and its portability. After the Heydrich mission, the British tried to fix the Sten's image for the regular troops. They introduced the Mark V, which was the Ordnance Department's way of apologizing for the earlier plumbing models. They gave it a wooden buttstock, a pistol grip, and even a front sight assembly that could take a bayonet. It looked like a real rifle and felt balanced in the hand. But by the time the Mark V hit the field in 1944, the ugly Mark II had already won the War of the Shadows. The Mark V was a polished tool for a professional army. But the Mark II was the weapon of the revolution, and that revolution didn't stop in 1945. When World War II ended, the world was awash in millions of surplus Stens. They didn't disappear, they became the fuel for the next 30 years of global conflict. You find the Sten in the hands of the Haganah fighting for the birth of Israel, in the jungles of Malaya, and in the hands of the Viet Minh fighting the French in Indochina. The Sten had taught the world a dangerous and lasting lesson. It taught the world that a state doesn't have a monopoly on firepower anymore. If you have a lathe and a few pieces of steel tubing, you can arm an army of thousands. The Sten became the grandfather of the modern insurgent weapon, proving you don't need a massive industrial base to challenge a superpower. The Sten was so simple that people started copying it in their own backyards. The Polish resistance built their own version, the Błyskawica, in secret underground workshops in Warsaw without a proper factory or specialized tools. Even the Germans, the people who had mocked the Sten as plumbing, eventually became so desperate by 1945 that they started making their own version, the MP3004. When the masters of precision engineering start copying your junk, you know you've won the intellectual battle of the century. The Sten was the ultimate validation that in total war, the best weapon is the one you actually have in your hand when the enemy is at the door. It was the triumph of the practical over the theoretical. How do we evaluate the Sten today? As a shooter, it is still a nightmare to handle. The ergonomics are terrible, the sights are a joke, and it feels like it's going to fall apart if you look at it too hard. But as a piece of history, it is a masterpiece of industrial logic and survival. It was the iron will of an island that refused to break, forged in a scrap heap when everyone else said the war was over. It reminds us that when things are at their darkest, brilliance isn't found in a showroom. It's found in the ability to take something useless and turn it into a tool of liberation. The Sten wasn't just a gun. It was a promise that as long as you have the grit to pick up a piece of iron, you are never truly defeated. At Timeless Arms, we don't just care about the winners, we care about the steel that had a soul. Now, I want to hear from our community, especially those of you in the UK and the States who might have a family connection to these pieces of history. If you were on that street corner in Prague, would you have trusted your life to a $10 pipe? Or would you have traded it for a captured German MP40? Was the Sten's ugliness a mechanical flaw? Or was it a psychological masterstroke against a perfection-obsessed enemy? Do you think the British were right to apologize for it with the Mark V? Or was the Mark II already perfect in its own crude way? Let's get a conversation going in the comments. I check every single one, and your insights are what make this community the best on the platform. We are Timeless Arms, and we are pushing hard for our subscriber goals to keep these hidden histories alive for the next generation. If you haven't joined the ranks yet, hit that subscribe button and stand with us as we uncover the stories the textbooks forgot. We need your voice to keep this mission moving forward. Thank you for being part of the journey and helping us preserve the legacy of the steel that fought for freedom. Until next time, this is Timeless Arms,